Good evening, dear listeners, and a very warm welcome to you all, wherever you're tuning in from tonight. Maybe cozied up in bed, listening from your favorite quiet corner at home, or perhaps relaxing somewhere peaceful with the world fading away outside. I'm so glad you've joined me here. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Maybe pull the covers up a bit higher and feel the day gently slip away. Let the story begin. The village of Little Puddleford seemed peaceful that summer, where the hedgerows were heavy with hawthorn blossom and the river flowed gently past the mill, where secrets seemed impossible. Then Colonel Reginald Blackwood was found dead at his desk in the study of Blackwood House. His face contorted, a glass of sherry overturned beside him. Police called it a simple heart attack, said the natural end for a man of his age and temperament. But Miss Marple saw the tiny speck of white powder on the rim of the glass that didn't belong to any heart medicine. 5 categories of evidence hide in this story. The hunt begins. Chapter 1. The hunt begins. The morning light slanted through the tall windows of Blackwood House, painting long golden stripes across the study's Persian rug. Colonel Reginald Blackwood sat motionless at his broad mahogany desk, head fallen forward, one hand still loosely curled around a silver fountain pen. His face was frozen in an expression of startled pain, eyes wide and glassy. Beside his elbow lay an overturned crystal sherry glass. A dark stain spread across the green leather blotter and dripped steadily onto the floorboards with a soft, persistent plop. The Eleanor Blackwood stood frozen in the doorway, both hands pressed to her lips. The sharp, nutty scent of spilled sherry mingled with the faint lavender drifting from the sachet pinned inside her cardigan. He was perfectly well at breakfast, she whispered, voice trembling. He took his usual pills, grumbled about the post, and came in here to write letters. I only stepped out to speak to Cook for 10 minutes. Her breath caught. When I returned, this. Constable Briggs arrived soon after, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the gravel path outside the open French windows. He removed his helmet as he entered, revealing a flushed forehead. The study already felt stuffy. The coal fire in the grate still gave off a pleasant warmth despite the chill morning air creeping in. Heart, most likely, ma'am, he said gently, eyes flicking to the body. These things happen with gentlemen of his years. Dr. Ellis will be here shortly. Yet his fingers kept twisting the brim of his helmet in small, anxious circles. Miss Jane Marple had been taking morning tea with her old friend Mrs. Bantry at Glebe House, just across the lane. The news reached her by way of the milk boy, who had seen the constable's bicycle propped against the gate. She set down her cup at once, the strong black tea still hot on her tongue, and walked the short distance in her sensible shoes. The gravel path crunched underfoot. Birds chattered in the beech trees lining the drive. When she stepped into the study, the first thing she noticed was the smell, sherry, coal smoke, and the faint polish the housekeeper used on the furniture every Tuesday. Something in this room is wrong. Can you spot it? Miss Marple paused just inside the threshold, knitting bag hanging from her arm. Her needles began their familiar soft clicking as she surveyed the scene. The Colonel's pill bottle stood open on the desk, cap resting on the floor some distance away, too far for a man in the grip of a fatal attack to have flung it. The French window was closed and latched from the inside. Fresh scratches marred the brass latch plate. She moved closer, the rough tweed of her coat brushing the smooth china of a small rose-patterned vase on the side table. Watch their hands, their eyes. What do they betray? Mrs. Blackwood's fingers twisted together at her waist. I found him like this at 9:30, she said. Her gaze slid away from the desk toward the fireplace, then back again. I called out, but he didn't answer. I touched his shoulder. He was already cold. Miss Marple noted the way the widow's left hand kept rising to cover her right wrist, as though concealing a small bruise or mark. Constable Briggs cleared his throat. Best not disturb anything further, miss. The doctor will want to see it as it is. But Miss Marple had already bent slightly, peering at the rug near the desk leg. A single tiny white speck, barely visible, rested on the deep blue wool. She did not touch it. Instead, she straightened, needles pausing for the briefest moment. Did you catch that? The window was locked from the inside. Dr. James Ellis arrived presently, black bag in hand. He was a tall man with a clipped military mustache and steady grey eyes. Kneeling beside the body, he felt for a pulse, then sniffed the stain on the blotter. Digitalis? I should think, he murmured. An overdose of his own heart medicine. Tragic, but not altogether surprising. His voice remained calm, yet the hand that lifted the pill bottle trembled once before he slipped it into his coat pocket. Sharp listeners noticed 3 things already out of place. File this away. It matters later. Mrs. Blackwood led everyone into the drawing room, while the doctor completed his examination. The kettle sang in the kitchen. Soon a tray appeared, bearing strong tea and sweet shortbread biscuits. Miss Marple accepted a cup. The china felt cool and delicate against her fingers, the tea scalding and bitter on her tongue. The worn leather of the armchair creaked as she settled into it. She spoke quietly with the household. Mrs. Agnes Pratt, the housekeeper, smelled faintly of baking bread and furniture polish. Her starched apron crackled as she wrung her hands. I poured his sherry myself at 9:15, same as every morning, she said. He liked it exactly then. I left the decanter on the tray and went back to the kitchen. Her eyes darted toward the study door and away again. Old Mr. Higgs, the gardener, waited outside by the rose beds. The sweet perfume of early stalks and sweet peas drifted on the breeze. I was clipping the yew hedge from 7 until 9:30. He told Miss Marple through the open window. Heard nothing out of the ordinary. Only the birds, the church bells for 1:15, and the colonel's fountain pen scratching away when I passed under the window earlier. Captain Henry Blackwood, the colonel's son, arrived by taxi from the station just before noon. His army boots left faint mud on the polished parquet. We argued last night, he said bluntly when questioned. Money, mostly. Father was cutting my allowance again. I caught the 8 o'clock train to London. Asked the porter at the station. I was gone long before this. His rough hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Miss Lydia Blackwood, the daughter, came slowly down the stairs in a soft wool dress. Her eyes were red from crying. Father refused to allow my engagement to Mr. Temple, she said, fingers gripping the cold metal of the banister. He said an artist would never provide for me. We quarreled yesterday afternoon. I went to my room and stayed there until Mother screamed. The nephew, Mr. Gerald Smythe, telephoned from his club in London. His voice sounded thin over the crackling line in the hall. I was playing bridge all morning. Uncle Reggie's solicitor can confirm the appointment I had at 11. Yes, he altered the will last month, but I've no idea what changes were made. The heavy receiver felt cool against Miss Marple's ear as she listened. Before I continue, what do you think happened? That evening, Miss Marple sat beside the fire at Glebe House. Cold smoke curled up the chimney. Lavender polish scented the air. The clock ticked steadily on the mantel. She took up her knitting, needles clicking rhythmically, then paused. "How very interesting," she murmured. "It reminds me so much of poor Mr. Carruthers in St. Mary Mead. Found dead at his desk, sherry glass beside him. Hard said everyone. But I noticed the pill bottle cap had rolled too far under the desk for a natural seizure, and the window was locked from inside. Yet the gardener had seen a shadow cross the lawn at 8:30. The nephew owed terrible gambling debts, just as young Henry seems to now. The housekeeper poured the sherry every morning. She had loved the old man quietly for years. In the end, we learned the nephew had been adding digitalis to the decanter for weeks. He slipped in through the garden door while the gardener's back was turned, locked the window from inside to suggest suicide or accident, then left the same way. The housekeeper unwittingly served the fatal dose. The nephew inherited, paid his debts, and was later hanged. One notices these small things, living quietly in a village. People really are very much alike everywhere. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking. The fire crackled warmly, chasing the evening chill from the room. She sipped the last of her tea, now cool but still comforting. The hunt begins. 5 categories await. Chapter 2. Gathering Evidence. The afternoon sun had warmed the gravel paths of Little Bottleford, but inside Blackwood House, the air still carried the faint chill of morning and the lingering sharpness of spilled sherry. Miss Marple settled herself in the small morning room, where the scent of garden roses drifted through the half-open window, mingling with the smell of freshly brewed tea and the faint coal smoke from the breakfast fire that had only just died down. Her knitting needles moved steadily, the soft wool sliding smoothly between her fingers as she waited for the first of the household to come in. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood entered first, smoothing the front of her dark wool dress, and the fabric felt slightly rough under her palms, where she had been twisting it all morning. She sat opposite Miss Marple, accepting the cup of tea with a small nod. The china was warm against her hands, the tea strong and slightly bitter on her tongue. "I keep thinking of that window," Mrs. Blackwood said quietly. "It was locked from the inside. I remember Reginald complaining only last week that the latch was stiff. He had to oil it himself. How could anyone have got out and locked it again?" Her voice wavered at the end. Miss Marple's needles paused. "How very interesting. Did you notice anything else about the study this morning, Mrs. Blackwood? Anything at all that seemed out of place?" The widow frowned. The sherry glass. He never drank more than half before 10 o'clock. Yet the glass was nearly empty when I found him, and the bottle on the tray. It looked as though more had been poured than usual. She pressed her lips together. "But surely that means nothing. He might have been thirsty. Something doesn't fit here. Can you see it?" Miss Marple nodded gently. "One does notice these small habits, living in a house together. File this away. It matters later." Next came Captain Henry Blackwood. He strode in still wearing his army greatcoat, the rough tweed smelling faintly of railway smoke and London fog. He refused tea, but accepted a glass of water. The cold metal tumbler clinked against the tray as he set it down too hard. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the silence between them. "I told you already," he began without preamble. "I caught the 8 o'clock train. The porter at the station knows me. He'll confirm it. I was in London by 9:15. I'll at my club by 10. I didn't even know father was dead until the telegram reached me at 12:30. Miss Marple tilted her head. And last night's quarrel? You mentioned money. Henry's jaw tightened. He was cutting my allowance again. Said I spent too much on cards and horses. I told him I needed the money for a new posting, uniforms, kit, all that. He wouldn't listen. I left the house at 7:30, walked to the station. That's all. His right hand kept opening and closing on the arm of the chair. Miss Marple watched the movement carefully. Watched their hands, their eyes. What did they betray? Did the porter clip your ticket? She asked mildly. Henry blinked. Of course. Why wouldn't he? Miss Marple smiled. Some porters are careless with the early trains. But no matter. We shall ask him. Sharp listeners may have caught the first small crack in the timeline already. The hunt for fractures has begun. Miss Lydia Blackwood came in next. She had changed into a soft lamb's wool cardigan. The wool felt comforting against her arms, though her fingers were cold. She accepted tea and a biscuit. The sweet shortbread crumbled on her tongue as she nibbled nervously. I was in my room all morning, she said at once. After breakfast, I went upstairs. I heard nothing until Mother screamed. Father had forbidden me to see Mr. Temple again. We argued yesterday. He said if I persisted, he would cut me out of his will entirely. Her voice trembled. I didn't wish him dead. I only wanted him to understand. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. And did you leave your room at all between breakfast and 9:30? Lydia hesitated. Only once. I went down to the library to fetch a book at about 9:15. I was back upstairs within 5 minutes. The house was quiet. I heard the grandfather clock strike the quarter hour. The clock in question stood in the hall. Its deep chime could be heard throughout the house. Miss Marple made a small note in her mind. Before we go further, what do you make of that 5-minute absence? The last interview took place in the hall, where the telephone stood on a small oak table. Miss Marple had asked Mr. Gerald Smythe to telephone again from London. The line crackled. His voice sounded distant but calm. Miss Marple, you wish to speak with me? Yes, Mr. Smythe. About this morning. You said you were at your club. Precisely. I breakfasted there at 8, played bridge from 9 until 11:30. Several members can vouch for me. I had no idea Uncle Reginald had passed until your call. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. And the will? You mentioned it had been changed last month. A pause. Yes, Uncle spoke of it. He was displeased with certain family matters. But I never saw the document. The solicitor holds it. The receiver felt heavy and cool in her hand. The ticking of the hall clock seemed suddenly louder. That evening, Miss Marple walked back to Glebe House as the sun dipped behind the church tower. The chill wind carried the scent of wood smoke from cottage chimneys and the faint sweetness of late roses still blooming along the lane. She sat by the fire with Mrs. Bantry, the coal crackling cheerfully, on the room warm and smelling of lavender polish and baking scones from tea. Mrs. Bantry poured sherry, dry and pale. Well, Jane, what do you make of it all? Miss Marple sipped. The sherry tasted sharp after the day's strong tea. Several small things are beginning to gather, dear. The nearly empty glass, when the Colonel rarely finished more than half. The 5 minutes Lydia spent downstairs. Henry's certainty about the ticket being clipped. Gerald's very prompt denial of seeing the will. She set the glass down. And then there is the matter of time itself. The church clock struck the quarter hour at 9:15. Everyone agrees on that. Yet Mrs. Pratt insists she poured the sherry at 9:15 exactly and went straight back to the kitchen. The colonel was heard scratching with his pen shortly before then by Mr. Higgs, under the window. But if the fatal dose was in the sherry, when was it added? And by whom? Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. The timeline just cracked. Did you catch where? Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. You mean the quarter hour? Precisely. If Mrs. Pratt poured at 9:15, and the colonel was still writing then, how long did it take him to drink enough to kill him? Digitalis acts quickly and overdose, yet no one heard him cry out or fall until Mrs. Blackwood returned near 9:30. 15 minutes is a very long time for a man to sit in agony without making a sound, unless the dose was given earlier, or unless something else entirely happened to that sherry between 9:15 and 9:30. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Evidence gathers, on but which matters. Chapter 3. The trail deepens. The next morning broke grey and damp over Little Puddleford. A light mist clung to the hedgerows, carrying the clean, earthy smell of wet grass and the faint coal smoke rising from cottage chimneys. Inside Blackwood House, the air felt heavier. The scent of yesterday's spilled sherry had faded, replaced by the comforting aroma of baking bread from the kitchen and the sharp polish Mrs. Pratt had applied to the hall furniture at dawn. Miss Marple arrived early, her sensible shoes leaving faint damp prints on the polished parquet. She found Dr. Ellis already in the study, coat off, sleeves rolled up. The coal fire had been relit. Its warm crackle filled the room, chasing away the morning chill. The doctor held the colonel's pill bottle in one hand, frowning at the label, while the glass vial felt cold against his palm. Digitalis, as I thought, he said without looking up, but the count is wrong. There should be 30 tablets remaining after yesterday's dose. Only 27 are here, 3 missing. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, then stilled. 3 tablets. A fatal overdose could be achieved with far less than that in a single glass, I believe. Dr. Ellis nodded slowly. If dissolved completely, yes. But Reginald was careful. He never took more than prescribed. And the bottle was kept locked in his desk drawer at night. Only he and Mrs. Blackwood had keys. Something doesn't fit here. Can you see it? Miss Marple stepped to the desk. She bent and examined the underside of the drawer edge, where the key usually hung on a small brass hook. A single fine scratch marred the wood, fresh, yet barely visible. The drawer was forced, she murmured, not violently, just enough to slip the lock. Dr. Ellis straightened. You think someone tampered with the pills themselves? Or took them to dissolve elsewhere, Miss Marple replied gently. One notices these small marks, living quietly in a village. They were interrupted by Constable Briggs, who entered with heavy footsteps, helmet under his arm. The rough serge of his uniform smelled faintly of damp wool and bicycle oil. I've spoken to the station porter again, miss. He remembers Captain Henry clearly. Says the ticket was clipped at 8 o'clock sharp. But here's the odd thing. The train was delayed 7 minutes leaving the platform. It didn't pull out until 8:07. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Did yours? The constable continued. Like Captain Henry told us he was in London by 9:15. But with the delay, the train reached the terminus closer to 9:30. He'd have had to run to make his club by 10. The timeline just cracked wider. Did you catch where? Before the constable could say more, Mrs. Blackwood appeared in the doorway. Her face was pale. The soft wool shawl around her shoulders did little to warm the chill that seemed to have settled in her bones. I've something to tell you, she said quietly. I didn't want to say it yesterday. Shock, I suppose. But Reginald and I, we weren't happy. Not for years. He had an arrangement with someone in the village. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. An arrangement, Mrs. Blackwood. The widow's hands twisted in the shawl. A woman. Mrs. Clara Temple, Mr. Temple's widowed mother. She keeps the little tea shop by the bridge. Reginald visited her twice a week for years. I knew. I pretended not to. It kept the peace. Her voice dropped. And she has a son, Lionel Temple. The same Lionel my daughter wishes to marry. Hidden connections began to surface. These two share a secret. What connects them? Miss Marple spoke softly. So Captain Henry's money troubles, Miss Lydia's forbidden engagement, Mr. Gerald's expectations under the will, and now a long-standing liaison that might have given Mrs. Temple or her son motive and opportunity. Mrs. Blackwood nodded once, then turned away, shoulders trembling. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked down to the tea shop by the river. The bell above the door tinkled as she entered. The air inside was rich with the smell of fresh scones, strong tea, and a trace of lavender from the sachets Mrs. Temple hung among the linens. The wooden tables were smooth under her fingers, worn by years of cups and saucers. Mrs. Clara Temple was a handsome woman of about 50, her dark hair streaked with silver, apron dusted with flour. She brought Miss Marple a pot of tea without being asked. The china was hot, the tea fragrant and comforting. "You've come about the Colonel," she said, before Miss Marple could speak. I heard. "I'm sorry for Mrs. Blackwood, truly, but Reginald and I—" It was understood. No promises. No scandal. Miss Marple sipped. The tea was hot enough to scald her tongue slightly. "And your son, Mrs. Temple, Mr. Lionel." Clara's hand paused on the teapot. Lionel knew nothing of it until recently. When the Colonel refused the engagement, Lionel came to me in tears, and I told him the truth then. He was angry, furious with his father's memory and with Reginald, but he would never— Her voice faltered. Miss Marple watched the woman's hands. They trembled very slightly as she poured a second cup. Watch their hands, their eyes. What do they betray? "I believe you," Miss Marple said gently. But someone entered the study. Someone who knew the Colonel's habits. Someone who could add the digitalis to the sherry or to the pills without being seen. Mrs. Temple looked down at the table. "The back gate to Blackwood House is never locked during the day. Anyone could slip through the garden." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed." That evening she sat once more by the fire at Glebe House. The coal smoke curled lazily up the chimney. The room smelled of lavender polish, warm wool, and the faint sweetness of the biscuits left from tea. The clock ticked steadily. She took up her knitting, needles moving in their familiar rhythm, then paused. "How very interesting," she murmured. "It reminds me so much of the case of Mrs. Latham in St. Mary Mead. She kept a boarding house, very respectable. One winter, her wealthiest lodger, old Mr. Forbes, was found dead in his room. Heart failure, everyone said. But I noticed the medicine bottle on his washstand had been moved. The label was facing the wrong way, and there was a tiny smear of powder on the glass shelf underneath, exactly like the speck we saw yesterday. Mrs. Latham had a niece who was secretly engaged to the lodger's nephew. The nephew owed money, just as Captain Henry does now. The niece visited her aunt every Tuesday to help with the washing. Though on the last Tuesday she slipped into Mr. Forbes's room while he was out walking, dissolved 3 of his heart tablets in his evening sherry decanter, then left by the back stairs. Mrs. Latham unwittingly served the fatal glass that night. The niece hoped to inherit enough through the nephew to start a dress shop in Taunton. We found the empty tablet wrappers in the dustbin, wrapped in her own handkerchief. She confessed when the laundry mark was traced. She was sent to prison for 5 years. The nephew married someone else. One notices these small things: powder specks, wrong-facing labels, trembling hands. People are really very much alike everywhere, whether in a boarding house or a gentleman's study. Miss Marple's needles resumed clicking. The fire crackled warmly. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes with a low, persistent moan. Or the trail deepens. Stay sharp. Chapter 4. False Trails. The third day after the Colonel's death dawned bright and crisp. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of Blackwood House, warming the oak floors and carrying the sweet scent of late-blooming garden roses through every open sash. Inside, however, the atmosphere remained thick with unease. The smell of strong tea lingered in the drawing room, mixed with the faint, cold smoke from the freshly stoked fire and the sharp tang of furniture polish Mrs. Pratt had used that morning. Miss Marple arrived with her knitting bag, the soft wool of her scarf brushing her chin against the lingering chill wind outside. Constable Briggs met her in the hall. His boots left faint damp marks on the parquet. The rough serge of his uniform smelled of bicycle oil and morning mist. "I've been checking alibis again, miss," he said, voice low. "Thought you'd like to hear the latest before we speak to anyone." Miss Marple nodded. "Small details often hide the largest truths, Constable. Pray continue." He consulted his notebook. First, young Mr. Lionel Temple. The artist, Miss Lydia, wishes to marry. His mother says he was in the tea shop all morning, helping with deliveries. But the postman remembers seeing him walking briskly up the lane toward Blackwood House at 8:20. He was back at the shop by 9, says Mrs. Temple. Miss Marple's needles clicked once. A window of opportunity, then, and motive, perhaps, if he blamed the Colonel for blocking the engagement. Something doesn't fit here. Can you see it? Before Briggs could answer, Captain Henry Blackwood appeared at the top of the stairs. He descended quickly, boots thudding. "I've just had a wire from London," he announced. "My club secretary confirms I arrived at 10 sharp. Several members saw me, and the porter at the London terminus remembers clipping my ticket at 9:35. The delay explains everything." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Yet the village porter insists your ticket was clipped here at 8 o'clock. 2 clippings on one ticket would be most unusual." Henry's face flushed. Perhaps he misremembered. Porters are busy men. Watch their hands, their eyes. What do they betray? Henry's fingers drummed rapidly against his thigh. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "We shall see." She moved next to the library, where Miss Lydia sat curled in an armchair, a soft wool rug over her knees. The room smelled of old books, beeswax polish, and the faint lavender from a bowl of potpourri on the mantel. Lydia's eyes were red again. She clutched a letter in her lap. "I received this from Lionel this morning," she said, voice trembling. "He says he came here that morning to speak to Father one last time. He admits he entered through the garden gate at 8:30, but he swears he only knocked on the study window, saw Father writing, and left when there was no answer. He was frightened, he says. He ran back to the tea shop." Miss Marple accepted the letter. The paper felt crisp and slightly damp from being carried in a pocket. "A brave admission," she murmured, "or a clever one. Did anyone see him knock?" Lydia shook her head. "He says the hedge was high. No one would have noticed." Before I continue, what do you think of this sudden confession? Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. File this away. Confessions can be as misleading as silences. She found Mr. Gerald Smythe waiting in the morning room. He had arrived by the midday train from London, suitcase still in the hall. The scent of railway smoke clung to his overcoat. His smooth leather gloves rested on the arm of the chair. He accepted tea. The china cup rattled faintly against the saucer as he set it down. I felt I should come in person, he said smoothly. The solicitor wired me. The will is to be read tomorrow. Uncle left me a small legacy, enough to settle a few debts. Nothing extravagant. I had no reason to wish him harm. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily. And yet you mentioned the changed will so quickly on the telephone, almost as though you expected questions. Gerald's smile was thin. No one likes to be prepared. Sharp listeners noticed the way his left hand kept smoothing an invisible crease in his trouser leg. A small, repetitive gesture. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked alone through the garden behind Blackwood House. The gravel paths crunched under her shoes. Birds sang in the apple trees, their calls sharp against the low hum of bees among the roses. The chill wind tugged at her scarf, but the sun warmed her face. She paused at the garden gate, never locked during daylight, as Mrs. Temple had said. A small brass button lay half buried in the dirt beside the path. She bent and picked it up with her handkerchief. The metal felt cold, the engraving faint but recognizable. A regimental crest, the same as those on Captain Henry's greatcoat. Did you catch that? A button where no button should be. She tucked it away and continued to the tea shop. Mrs. Temple was alone, wiping tables. The air smelled of fresh scones, strong tea, and the sweet trace of jam. The wooden counter felt smooth under Miss Marple's fingers as she leaned in. Your son came here that morning, she said gently. Mrs. Temple's cloth stilled. Yes, he told me later. He only wanted to plead his case. Reginald was writing, he said. Lionel tapped the window, got no answer, and left. He was back before 9. I swear it. Miss Marple nodded. And the deliveries? The postman saw him walking the other way. Clara's hands tightened on the cloth. He must have mistaken the time, or the direction. Miss Marple left without pressing further. The bell tinkled behind her as she stepped into the afternoon light. Evening found her once more at Glebe House. The fire crackled warmly, coal smoke curled up the chimney, blending with the lavender polish and the comforting smell of baking apple pie cooling on the kitchen sill. Mrs. Bantry poured dry sherry. The glass felt cool in Miss Marple's hand, the taste sharp and nutty on her tongue. So many trails, Mrs. Bantry said, settling into the opposite chair. Lionel at the window, Henry's button in the garden, Gerald's calm certainty, Lydia's letter. Which do you believe? Miss Marple sipped slowly. None of them entirely dear. Not yet. Lionel's confession explains the shadow Mr. Higgs may have seen, but not the missing tablets or the forced drawer. Henry's button could have been lost days earlier. Gardeners tread those paths constantly. Gerald's debts are real, but small. And Lydia, she is protecting someone, perhaps. She set the glass down. On the clock ticked steadily on the mantel. Some trails are false, she murmured. They lead us in circles, away from the center. The button distracts us from the powder speck. The confession distracts us from the timeline. The calm alibi distracts us from the trembling hand. Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet rhythm. The fire popped, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Outside, the church bells tolled the hour, deep and clear against the gathering dusk. Some trails are false, which lead to truth. Chapter 5. The pattern forms. The fourth morning after Colonel Blackwood's death brought a sudden change in the weather. Heavy clouds rolled in from the west, turning the sky the color of old pewter, and a cold, steady drizzle began to fall over Little Buttleford. Inside Blackwood House, the rooms felt smaller, the air thick with the smell of damp wool, coal smoke from every grate, and the persistent trace of lavender polish that clung to the furniture. Miss Marple arrived shortly after 10, umbrella dripping on the hall tiles, her knitting bag protected beneath her coat. She found all the principal suspects already gathered in the drawing room at her request. Mrs. Blackwood sat nearest the fire, hands folded tightly in her lap. The soft wool of her shawl rose and fell with each quick breath. Captain Henry stood by the window, staring out at the rain-lashed garden, his rough tweed jacket still damp from his morning walk. Miss Lydia perched on the edge of a sofa, fingers twisting a handkerchief. The lamb's wool throw across her knees looked too warm for the room's sudden chill. Mr. Gerald Smythe occupied an armchair, legs crossed, on one smooth leather shoe tapping a slow rhythm against the carpet. Mrs. Clara Temple and her son Lionel had been asked to attend as well. They sat together on a small settee, the mother's apron exchanged for a neat dark dress, the son's artist's smock replaced by a plain jacket that still carried the faint smell of turpentine and oil paint. Constable Briggs stood near the door, helmet in hand, watching everyone with quiet attention. Dr. Ellis had come too, black bag at his feet, expression grave. Miss Marple settled herself in the center chair, needles clicking softly as she arranged her bag. The fire crackled. Rain tapped insistently against the window panes. The room smelled of strong tea, freshly poured, and the sweet, crumbly scent of shortbread biscuits on the tray. "I have asked you all here," she began in her gentle voice, because certain matters have become clear. The pattern is forming, and patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. She turned first to Captain Henry. "You told us your ticket was clipped at the station here at 8 o'clock sharp. Yet the London porter clipped it again at 9:35. 2 clippings on 1 ticket. That is impossible unless the ticket was never presented on the outward journey." Henry's face paled. His hands clenched at his sides. I missed the 8 o'clock. I walked back. I needed time to think after the quarrel. I came straight here through the garden gate. I only meant to speak to father again. I tapped on the window. He was writing. I left." Miss Lydia gave a small gasp. "You were here." Henry nodded once, eyes on the carpet. "I saw him alive at 8:30. I swear it. I went to the station after that, to caught the 9:15 instead. That's why the London clipping was later." Major confrontation had begun. The room grew very still, except for the fire and the rain. Miss Marple turned to Lionel Temple. "And you, Mr. Temple, also came through the garden gate that morning. You too tapped on the window. You too saw the colonel writing. You too left without answer. 2 visitors at the same window, within minutes of each other. Yet neither of you saw the other." Lionel swallowed. "I didn't see anyone. The hedge was thick. I was only there a moment." Miss Marple's needles paused. 2 young men, both angry, both pleading their cases, both arriving at the same window within a narrow space of time. And yet the colonel continued writing, undisturbed. No interruption, no raised voices, no sign of agitation in his last moments. She looked around the circle. "Now let us consider the missing tablets. 3 digitalis pills gone from the bottle, the drawer forced, very skillfully. Someone knew exactly where the key was kept. Mrs. Blackwood spoke suddenly, voice low. I kept a spare key in my jewelry box. Only I knew it was there, or so I thought. Miss Marple nodded. And who had access to your room, Mrs. Blackwood? Who might have seen you open that box? The widow's gaze moved slowly to her daughter. Lydia's face crumpled. I borrowed Mother's pearl brooch 2 weeks ago, Lydia whispered. I saw the key when I put it back. I didn't touch it, I swear. Miss Marple spoke gently. Yet someone did. And someone dissolved those 3 tablets in liquid, likely the Colonel's morning sherry, so that the dose would be taken all at once. Behavioral breakdown came next. Gerald Smythe uncrossed his legs. His foot stopped tapping. A thin sheen of sweat appeared on his upper lip, despite the cool room. You have been very calm, Mr. Smythe, Miss Marple observed. Almost too calm. From the first telephone call you spoke of the changed will as though you already knew its terms. Yet you claimed never to have seen the document. Gerald's mouth opened, then closed. I heard rumors from friends in London. Miss Marple shook her head. No, you knew because you read it. The solicitor's office was burgled 2 nights before the Colonel's death. A small pane broken in the back window. Nothing taken, except time to read certain papers left on the desk. Gerald's hand jerked. The teacup rattled violently against the saucer. Tea slopped over the rim onto his fingers. He did not seem to notice the heat. Watch their hands, their eyes. What did they betray? His pupils had dilated wide. Miss Marple continued. You learned the Colonel intended to leave you nothing beyond a token sum. Enough to mock you. You owed far more than you admitted. The club debts were the least of it. There were moneylenders, threatening letters. You needed the money quickly. Gerald's voice cracked. That's not... I didn't... You came down from London the night before, Miss Marple said. Not by train. By motor car, borrowed from a friend who owed you a favor. You arrived after dark. You waited in the garden until morning. You watched the house. And you saw Henry leave for the station. You saw Lionel come and go. You waited until Mrs. Pratt poured the sherry at 9:15. Then you slipped in through the French windows, while the Colonel was still writing, added the dissolved digitalis to the glass already on the tray, and left by the same way, locking the window from inside with a thin blade or wire through the crack. You knew the latch was stiff. You had watched him oil it. The scratches were yours. The room was silent, except for the rain and the fire. Crucial evidence surfaced then. Miss Marple reached into her bag and produced a small square of blotting paper. Found this morning under the study carpet near the window. A tiny smear of white powder, digitalis residue. And beside it, a single fiber, dark blue wool. The exact shade and weave of the overcoat you are wearing now, Mr. Smythe. Gerald stared at the paper. His face worked. Then, quite suddenly, he buried his head in his hands. I didn't mean to kill him, he choked. Only to make him ill. Delay the will. Give me time to pay the worst of the debts. I thought 3 tablets would make him collapse for a day or 2. I didn't know it would be so quick. Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking. Digitalis is unpredictable in overdose, especially when taken all at once in liquid. She looked around at the stunned faces. The pattern forms. Do you see it? Mrs. Blackwood rose slowly and went to the window, pressing her forehead to the cool glass. Lydia reached for her mother's hand. Henry turned from staring at the rain. His shoulders sagged with something like relief. Lionel and Clara Temple sat very close, hands clasped, and the constable stepped forward quietly. "Mr. Gerald Smythe, I must ask you to accompany me." Gerald did not resist. He stood, coat hanging loose, eyes dull. The rain drummed harder against the panes as he was led away. Miss Marple remained seated a moment longer. The fire crackled. The tea in the pot had gone cold. She sipped once more from her own cup. The liquid tasted bitter now, but steadying. How very interesting, she thought. The pattern had indeed formed. The pattern forms. Do you see it? Chapter 6. Secrets Unearthed. The rain continued through the afternoon, drumming steadily on the slate roofs of Little Puddleford and turning the garden paths of Blackwood House into shallow rivers of mud. Inside, the house felt hushed. The usual smells of baking and polish were subdued and replaced by the damp wool of drying coats in the hall, and the faint, persistent coal smoke from fires kept burning low against the chill. Miss Marple sat in the colonel's study, the room now empty of its former occupant. The desk had been cleared, except for a few personal papers the solicitor had not yet collected. The fire crackled softly. Warm light flickered across the green blotter, still bearing the faint dark stain of sherry. Constable Briggs had brought a small tin box from the safe in the master bedroom, Colonel Blackwood's private papers. The metal felt cold under Miss Marple's fingers as she lifted the lid. Inside lay letters, old photographs, bank statements, and a thin packet tied with faded ribbon. The scent of old paper and lavender sachet rose faintly from the contents. She untied the ribbon first. The letters were from Mrs. Clara Temple, written over a span of 12 years. The handwriting was neat, affectionate, but restrained. One, dated 5 years earlier, read, "Reginald, the boy asks after you again. He is growing tall and clever with his paints. I tell him stories of the soldier who was kind to us both. He does not know your name, but he carries your pocket knife, the one with the stag handle. I keep our promise. No one shall know." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. Hidden connections, long buried, were surfacing now. Another letter, more recent, carried a different tone. "Lionel has asked for Lydia's hand. Reginald, you cannot refuse him forever. He is your son in every way that matters. The village whispers already. Let them marry. Give him what is rightfully his." The paper felt brittle, and the ink had smudged slightly where tears had fallen long ago. Miss Marple set the letters aside and opened the small packet. Inside was a birth certificate. Lionel Temple, born 1932, Mother Clara Temple. Father listed simply as Reginald Blackwood, not married. A second document, a private acknowledgement signed by the colonel in 1948, promised Lionel a sum upon his 25th birthday, should he prove worthy. The 25th birthday had passed 3 months earlier. No payment had been made. The motive became starkly clear. Lionel had learned the truth, perhaps from his mother, perhaps from finding these very papers. He had confronted the colonel. The refusal to acknowledge him publicly, to provide for him, to allow the marriage to Lydia, had turned anger into something darker. Miss Marple closed the box. And the clock in the hall chimed the quarter hour. Its deep note echoed through the quiet house. She rose and walked to the French windows. The scratches on the latch were still visible. Fine, deliberate. She traced one with a gloved finger. The cold metal felt smooth, except for those tiny marks. Mrs. Blackwood entered then, carrying a tray with tea. The china cups rattled faintly. Steam carried the strong, comforting scent upward. She set the tray on the side table and poured without speaking. Miss Marple accepted a cup. The heat warmed her palms, the tea sharp on her tongue after the dry sweetness of a biscuit. "You knew," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Blackwood sat opposite, hands clasped around her own cup. "Not at first, not for many years. Reginald told me after Lionel was born, and he said it was a moment of weakness during the war. Clara was nursing at the military hospital. He never saw her again until he returned here, but he helped her quietly. Money for the shop, school fees for the boy. I accepted it because it kept him from scandal, and because I had no children of my own then." Her voice trembled. "When Lydia fell in love with Lionel, I begged Reginald to tell the truth, to allow the marriage. He refused, said it would ruin the family name, said the boy was illegitimate and always would be." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the will?" "Changed last month. He cut Lionel out entirely, left him nothing, not even the token sum promised. I found the draft in his desk. I burned it after he died. I thought perhaps it would protect Lydia." Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet rhythm. One notices these things while living in a house. The silences between husband and wife, the way eyes avoid certain names. Mrs. Blackwood looked down at her tea. "Gerald came to me 2 weeks ago. He had read the will at the solicitor's. He knew about Lionel, somehow. He offered to keep silent if I helped him. A loan, he called it. Enough to pay his debts. I refused." Miss Marple set her cup down. "And so Gerald acted alone. But the pattern is not yet complete." That afternoon she walked through the drizzle to the tea shop. The bell tinkled. The air inside was warm, with the smell of fresh scones, strong tea, and wet wool from customers' coats. Mrs. Temple stood behind the counter, face pale. Lionel sat at a corner table, staring at a sketchpad he had not touched. Miss Marple took a seat near them. "I have read your letters, Mrs. Temple. Do want the Colonel's acknowledgement." Clara's hand stilled on the teapot. Lionel looked up sharply. "The Colonel was your father," Miss Marple said to Lionel. "He knew it. He helped you quietly, but he would not acknowledge you openly. And when you asked for Lydia's hand, he refused." Lionel's voice was hoarse. "I went to him that morning. I tapped the window. He looked up, saw me, and waved me away, like I was nothing. I left. I didn't touch anything. I swear." Miss Marple spoke softly. "I believe you. But someone else was there after you left. Someone who knew the Colonel's habits. Someone who had read the will and knew time was short." Mrs. Temple's shoulders sagged. "Gerald telephoned me the night before, asked if I knew about the changed will. I told him what Reginald had promised Lionel years ago. Gerald laughed, said promises were nothing without signatures. He asked if I had a key to the house. I said no. But he knew about the garden gate." Miss Marple nodded. "Gerald watched the house. He saw Lionel come and go. He waited until the sherry was poured. Then he entered, added the digitalis, and left. Locking the window from inside was the cleverest part, using a thin blade to turn the latch through the crack. He had practiced it, no doubt, on his own windows in London." Lionel's hands clenched on the table. "He killed my father. For money." Mrs. Temple reached across and covered her son's hand with hers. The gesture was small, protective. "We never wanted this, only what was fair." Miss Marple rose. "Fairness is a hard thing to measure sometimes, but truth is clearer." Evening found her back at Glebe House. The fire burned steadily, though cold smoke mingled with lavender polish and the comforting smell of Mrs. Bantry's apple pie cooling on the sill. The rain had eased to a soft patter against the windows. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, needles moving in their familiar pattern. Mrs. Bantry poured sherry. So Gerald is the one. But the secrets, Lionel being the Colonel's son, that changes everything. Miss Marple sipped. The sherry tasted dry and warming. It explains so much. The anger, the desperation, the hidden letters. Gerald used what he knew to destroy what he could not have. But the pattern is nearly whole now. She paused, needle still. Secrets surface. Truth approaches. Chapter 7. The Revelation. The rain had stopped by evening, leaving the air fresh and cool over Little Puddleford. A thin mist rose from the river, carrying the clean scent of wet earth and garden flowers still blooming defiantly along the lanes. Inside Blackwood House, the drawing room felt warm and close. The coal fire had been built high, its crackle steady against the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Every lamp was lit, casting golden pools across the Persian rugs and the worn leather armchairs. The faint smell of strong tea lingered from the afternoon tray, now cleared away, replaced by the sharp, nutty trace of dry sherry poured for the occasion. Miss Marple had requested that everyone gather once more. They came without protest, drawn by the quiet certainty in her voice when she telephoned each one. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood sat nearest the fire, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, the soft wool brushing her chin. Captain Henry Blackwood stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, rough tweed jacket still carrying the damp of his afternoon walk. Miss Lydia sat beside her mother, fingers twisting a handkerchief, the lamb's wool throw across her lap untouched. Mr. Gerald Smythe had been brought from the police station under escort. He sat apart in a straight chair, coatless, wrists handcuffed loosely in his lap, face pale and eyes fixed on the carpet. Constable Briggs stood near the door, helmet under his arm. Dr. Ellis occupied the other armchair, black bag at his feet. Mrs. Clara Temple and Lionel sat together on the small settee, hands clasped, the mother's dark dress smelling faintly of tea-shop scones and lavender. Miss Marple sat in the center, knitting needles resting in her lap for once. She looked around the circle slowly, blue eyes calm and kind. "Don't we have come to the end of the hunt?" she said quietly. "The truth is ready to be spoken. I shall review each thread we have followed, so that nothing remains hidden." She began with physical evidence. First, the objects that did not fit. The pill bottle cap lay too far from the Colonel's hand to have been thrown in a seizure. The window latch showed fresh scratches, made by a thin blade turned from outside after the window was closed. The tiny white speck of digitalis powder on the rug near the desk leg. The smear of the same powder on a scrap of blotting paper found under the carpet by the French windows. And the single dark blue wool fiber caught in the same place. The exact shade and weave of Mr. Smythe's London overcoat. These were not accidents. They were traces left by someone who entered the study after the sherry was poured. He added the fatal dose and left by the same window, locking it behind him with care. Gerald's head bowed lower. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Next, the timeline fractures. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. The church clock struck the quarter hour at 9:15. Mrs. Pratt poured the sherry then and returned to the kitchen. Mr. Higgs heard the Colonel's pen scratching under the window shortly before. Yet the Colonel did not cry out or collapse until Mrs. Blackwood found him near 9:30. 15 minutes is too long for digitalis overdose to remain silent. The dose must have been added after 9:15. Between the pouring and the discovery, that narrow window pointed to someone who watched the house, waited for the right moment, and acted quickly. Captain Henry shifted. His boots creaked on the parquet. Captain Henry's train ticket was clipped twice. Once here at 8, once in London at 9:35. He had missed the 8 o'clock, walked back, tapped the study window at 8:30, then caught the later train. Mr. Lionel Temple did the same, tapped the window, saw the colonel writing, and left. Two visitors, neither seen by the other, neither guilty of the act that followed. She turned to spoken lies. Several statements contradicted earlier ones or known facts. Mr. Smythe claimed on the telephone that he had not seen the changed will. Yet he spoke of its terms with calm certainty. Later, he admitted reading it after breaking into the solicitor's office 2 nights before the death. He lied about being at his club all morning on the day itself. He had driven down the previous night and waited in the garden. Mrs. Blackwood spoke truthfully of her knowledge of the colonel's arrangement with Mrs. Temple, but withheld it at first from fear of scandal. Miss Lydia's account of staying in her room all morning was contradicted by her own admission of fetching a book at 9:15. Small lies, protective lies, desperate lies. But the central lie was Mr. Smythe's denial of presence and intent. Gerald made a small sound, almost a sob, but did not speak. Behavioral tells revealed guilt more plainly than words. Miss Marple's gaze rested on each face in turn. Mrs. Blackwood's hands twisting at her wrist, hiding old bruises from years of quiet unhappiness. Captain Henry's clenched fists, when speaking of money, guilt over debts, not murder. Miss Lydia's trembling fingers on the banister, fear for her future, not guilt. Mrs. and Temple's steady hands pouring tea, yet the slight shake when her son's name was mentioned, protective love, not deceit. Lionel's open face, the way he met every eye, honest anger, not hidden crime. She paused. But Mr. Smythe's foot tapping endlessly, the sheen of sweat on his lip in a cool room, the jerk of his hand spilling tea when confronted, the way his eyes darted to the door as though measuring escape. These were the tells of a man who had planned carefully, yet crumbled under scrutiny. Finally, hidden connections, the motive, the deepest thread. Colonel Blackwood was Lionel Temple's natural father, acknowledged privately in documents kept locked away. He supported the boy quietly for years, but refused to legitimize him or allow the marriage to Lydia. When Lionel learned the truth and pressed for recognition, when the colonel refused again and altered his will to exclude him entirely. Mr. Smythe discovered this, first through London gossip, then by reading the will in the solicitor's office. He knew the colonel's death before the new will could be signed, and witnessed would restore the old terms, in which Gerald received a substantial legacy, money to pay his crushing debts, money to silence the moneylenders. That was the true motive. Gerald lifted his head at last. His voice was hoarse. I didn't mean to kill him, only to delay. 3 tablets. I thought it would make him ill for a day, give me time I never imagined. Miss Marple spoke softly. Digitalis is treacherous in overdose, especially dissolved all at once. You watched from the garden. You saw Lionel leave. You waited until the sherry was poured. And you entered through the unlocked French windows, added the solution to the glass on the tray, left the same way, and turned the latch with a thin knife blade through the crack. You locked yourself out, but not the truth. Constable Briggs stepped forward. Gerald Smythe, I arrest you for the murder of Colonel Reginald Blackwood. Gerald did not resist as the handcuffs were checked and he was led to the door. The room remained silent, except for the fire's crackle and the soft drip of water from the eaves outside. Miss Marple picked up her knitting at last. The needles clicked once, twice. "The hunt ends," she said quietly. Truth revealed. Mrs. Blackwood rose slowly and crossed to her daughter. They embraced without words. Henry turned from the window. For the first time, his shoulders relaxed. Lionel looked at Lydia across the room. She gave a small, tremulous smile. Clara Temple pressed her son's hand tightly. Miss Marple looked around once more, then rose. The clock struck the hour. Deep, measured notes that seemed to settle over the house like a sigh of release. The hunt ends. Truth revealed.